The chamber was designed to impress people into silence. It succeeded with the same stubborn, bureaucratic efficiency with which it produced forms. Rows of chairs, upholstered in the same neutral grey as the directorate's seal, faced a raised dais where Auditor Primus and two equally monochrome deputies sat beneath a crest that resembled a stamped consent form and a stern colon. The lights were warm in a way that suggested someone had once read a memo and decided the room should feel dignified. Now the light had a habit of refracting through the edges of papers until they looked like miniature stained glass windows of red tape. Norman had never been in a room like it. He knew, clinically, that his reaction was disproportionate. He was a clerk in a department that managed catastrophes, and he had seen worse. A windowless basement where hurricanes were catalogued, a filing room where an extinct comet's paperwork still smelled faintly of ozone. But there was something about being in public that terrorized him more than any uxum celestial glitch. This was not only because he had the misfiled stamp in his pocket. It was because here in the formal light, the tendency toward procedure that had comforted him now felt like a coat too small for the weather. The hearing began, as such things often go, with music, not orchestral nor mournful, but the sort of hold music the department used when it put prophecies on pause, a looping melody based on a tepid kettle and a kazoo, harmonized with a rhythm that could only be notated in sticky notes. It seeped through the speakers and reminded Norman of every daytime waiting room he had ever endured. Someone in the audience made a small, irreverent noise at this, and the sound was swallowed by the room like a gumdrop slid under a Bible. Auditor Primus entered with the ceremonial gravity of someone who had once signed too many irrevocable orders and decided to never again make a light thing of a stamp. Its uniform was immaculate. It moved with the unhurried slowness of one who had never missed a box on a form. Its face was not so much a face as an impression, like an overused rubber stamp. When it spoke, the syllables fell measuredly and precisely as if they were accounting entries. "We are convened," it said, and the phrase vibrated through the Meccano ceremonial podium, "to examine the sequence that led to the activation of Protocol Armageddon, and to determine whether remedial precedent may be set." That was the formal part. The thing auditors avoided saying, both in conversation and in private memos hidden under teacups, was that the audience was mostly here to see what would happen when a room full of policy shone its light on a truth that didn't look like a form. Norman watched Aria sit very still and pin her red pen between the pages of a regulation like a talisman. He watched Tom keep his hands open at his sides, the kind of posture found in people who had spent a long time learning how not to be surprised by the absurd. He watched Rita clutch a binder to her chest as if it contained a fuse she could pull, if necessary. The first testimonies were as they always are, cautious, measured, heavy with cross-references. Analysts read logs. Gideon, in his habitual way, produced a stream of numbers and timestamps that meant more to the panel than any story. The logs were precise as lace, but they made no room for a quivering hand or a biscuit shared on a bench. They were, in every sense, what the directorate loved best, clean evidence with neat margins. Then the prophets began to speak. Prophet Alice was in the queue line 17, which she had always considered rude. Her voice came through the department's ancient intercom, corrugated and reverberant, the way a voice sounds when it has been held in a machine for too long. "You have me on music," she said at first, and there was an exasperation in it that made the lip of the nearest deputy flutter. "My prophecies have been put on hold. I have been waiting for hold music long enough to be nostalgic for it." There was a muted chorus of human laughter, the fragile kind that arises when people are pleased to be recognized as more than their job descriptions. Someone on the panel tapped a tablet to restore decorum. The sound echoed like a stamp being re-inked. Testimony moved from the technical into the human in a way that felt like stepping across a seam. Azra took the stand next, a shimmering presence whose metaphors always made the panel half listen and half translate. When a river forgets its name, Azra said, it flows anyway. That is the nature of living things. They do not wait for paperwork to honor their movements. The room registered this as both evidence and a decorative flourish. A clerk in the third row made a note, Azra, poetic, non-binding. The note was almost certainly stamped for the record. The directorate had, in the past, dismissed such metaphors as amusing but immaterial. This time, however, they landed on a committee already exposed to the human stories that had started to tack the seams of this hearing in ways that numbers could not explain. A nurse had testified about improvising delivery because the midwife had been held up in an untenable queue. A schoolteacher spoke about the day when a child's diagonal reading of a textbook saved the class' sense of future. These were small interventions, a hand steadying another hand, a biscuit shared between strangers, the quiet rearrangement of priorities that did not fit on any ledger. Norman felt his pulse in his throat. He had not planned to speak. He had not rehearsed the data-driven argument that Gideon had drafted for him, which included a string of quoted statutes and a footnote that stretched 2 inches into his packet. He had brought, instead, a small sheaf of paper folded into the same shape his mind took when it was nervous, marginalia. He had notes in the margins of his notes, as one does when they are trying to hold a trembling world accountable to a schedule. There were little poems, fragments of a failed exam, a receipt for a sandwich gone cold. There was also a sentence he had underlined 3 times, people who fumble are still people. When his name was called, he stood with the paperwork like a shield and an admission. Hal nodded at him, a soldierly gesture that in Hal's case meant we all wear our uniforms of awkwardness. You have 3 minutes and 42 seconds to present your testimony, Auditor Primus intoned. And the voice of the room recalculated into the small compartment of time the panel had allotted for those without titles. Norman looked at the digital clock on the lectern. The numerals glowed like a small, indifferent sun. He had 3 minutes and 42 seconds to condense a life into procedural relevance. He began haltingly, because he had practiced the wrong kind of speech. He began with a footnote, and then realized a footnote did not have a throat. He tucked the footnote away and read the thing in the margin of a margin, because margins were where his courage tended to live. When I was young, he began, avoiding the temptation to make the noise of proper legalese. My town had a library that closed early on Thursdays, so the librarian could water the ficus. People would linger on the steps, exchanging small things, sugar, news, worry. Once, when the ficus drooped, the whole town contributed teaspoons of water until the thing looked embarrassed but revived. Someone sniffed, possibly with laughter. Ryder's shoulders rose in private amusement, and Tom's mouth made a line that was either skepticism or the contour of a smile. Norman kept speaking. He spoke of biscuits kept in a desk drawer for emergencies, of a janitor who whistled lullabies older than the department, and how his whistle could make the teapot calm down. He spoke of a nurse's hands and the midwife who had been waiting on hold music. He read a scrap of poetry from his desk, a tiny, ridiculous thing about staplers and bravery, and this, somehow, felt more admissible than any order of red ink. All the while the clock blinked away their time. 3 minutes and 41 seconds. 3 minutes and 20. The room hummed. Somewhere a photocopier coughed. Norman's voice grew steadier, because the moment itself seemed to act as an ally. The formal constraints of the hearing made the human details sharper, like a spotlight on a stage. He closed with a line that came to him with the helplessness of something borrowed. We do not need tidy endings, because tidy endings are not always kind. Sometimes the kindness is the messy thing that doesn't fit in a box. If your forms are only for tidy things, you are deciding the shape of kindness. I ask you not to make kindness a shape. The final seconds expired. The room held its breath like a paused printer. Auditor Primus' blurred face registered what might have been confusion, or the legal equivalent of a cough. One of its deputies produced a notacard and scribbled a note that will, later, be filed under an awkward category. Someone very sensible, a person who had never once been moved by a half-remembered poem, exhaled and then tried to reassert the seriousness of the process by asking for citations. It was Mixter Enoch who deflated the attempt at finality. He was not supposed to speak. He was a custodian who existed to make the department function. But there are moments when custodianship is not merely mopping floors, it is the preservation of habit and the sheltering of memory. He tapped his mop against the floor in a pattern that sounded like punctuation. "I have swept through these halls for many years," he said simply, and the sound of his voice unmade the hearing chamber of its official dazzlement. "In my earlier days I served on a council. We were given a bowl of sand and told to measure how much could be held before the bowl broke. We kept measuring and measuring, and one day the bowl broke, and we learned that measuring is not the same as keeping. Sometimes you have to pick up the pieces." He did not offer legal precedent. He offered a domestic image, the simple business of picking up. The panel, which had been trained in precise categories and tidy decisions, listened as if someone had shown them a window they had never been given the instruction manual to open. Prophet Alice's voice cracked again from the intercom, and for a moment everything aligned: the janitor's simple domesticity, the prophet's impatience, Norman's small poems. Writer's binder opened to a page that had once been used to record grievances, and now looked like a ledger of living. The directorate could have responded with contempt, with an austere reminder that precedent and the avoidance of chaos were reasons enough to maintain their stance. Instead, they did something more interesting and far more dangerous for an institution. They wavered. There was a flurry of private exchanges. An aide pressed a tablet against Auditor Primus' palm. Someone in the back whispered something into Writer's ear and she nodded sharply, the motion of a person deciding to spend her stored indignation. Then Arya stood. She had been sitting for most of the hearing like a carved figure, composed, severe. But there are weighty things in people who wield memos as shields, and she had been keeping one heavier than her lapel pin. She walked to the lectern and produced, with a gesture that involved both ferocity and exhaustion, a file. It had been the file of the lover she had once saved by delaying a neighborhood scale terminate. She had no right to bring it, no permission stamped in the margins, but she had brought it anyway. "This is not procedure," she said plainly. "It is memory. It is what drove me to my desk and made me sit here every day and pretend. It is proof that an improper delay once saved a life without imploding the universe." Auditor Primus regarded her. Its tone wavered on the edge of institutional dismay. "Admirable," it said, "but dangerous. Exceptions breed exceptions. That is how chaos once took root. And that is why we are here," Rita snapped. "We are not asking for chaos. We are asking for the permission to care when care is necessary. To ask otherwise is to put a cost on the human." A murmur ran through the chamber. The corporate auditors, who had arrived in tasteful suits and the wrong kind of metaphors, leaned forward with predatory interest. They had not come for compassion. They had come to weigh profit versus precedent. "There is a market for certainty," one of them intoned, and the directorate's eyes, if those eyes could be said to be anything, flicked with consideration. And so the hearing ended with the most institutionally bureaucratic of all outcomes, an ultimatum. The directorate would not deny the existence of the human record the team had presented. It would not, in a single breath, sweep away the notion that precedent was perilous. Instead, it issued a condition that felt both reasonable and cruel: provide documentary proof of compassionate, non-standard intervention filed under the department's charter within 72 hours, or the Armageddon Protocol would proceed to the point of no return. The timescale was small enough to make panic useful and big enough to allow procedures to insist on their own primacy. Outside the chamber, In the corridor of waiting rooms where vinyl chairs pretended to be comfortable, Norman let out a breath he had been holding for too long. He felt lighter, and yet the weight of the 72 hours descended like a folder placed on his desk with a thud. Tom put a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that might have been patronizing if it were not also fellowship. Rita moved through the room like a general, distributing tasks and consolidating allies. Arya walked with a small, fierce dignity, the red pen clutched like a guarantee. There was, of course, paperwork to be done. Gideon already had a schematic of the logs and their vulnerabilities. Clara offered biscuits and practical cheer. Hor, very nearly smileless, produced a small folded sheet of paper with the precise phrasing for a legal hold. Mayor Enoch, mop at rest, walked past with a heedful glance that suggested he had more to sweep up than dirt. And somewhere, as the department reorganized itself like a desk after a clumsy reorganization, the prophets muttered among themselves, and the world hiccuped in little ways that suggested a distant throat clearing. The ultimatum had not solved anything. It had, however, converted the problem into a deadline, which is to bureaucracy what thunder is to weather, a formal sound that suggests imminent consequence. Norman walked back to his desk with his marginalia tucked like contraband in his pocket. He had, in 3 minutes and 42 seconds, done something he had never expected of himself. He had spoken not as a clerk but as a witness to the small, messy acts that make a life worth saving. He had been precise in the only way he knew how, by attending to detail, by listing biscuits and lullabies, and the day the ficus nearly died. The 72 hours stretched ahead like a long, unfiled day. It would be filled with all the things a department could do: petitions, marshaled testimonies, back channels, and perhaps some amount of bribery in the form of a rare gold paper clip, and a promise of continued access to the better biscuits. There would be pockets of tenderness, a teacher who had kept a child's doodle as evidence of future imagination, a nurse who would testify about a birth born on improvisation, and there would be procedural snares, and the corporate auditors who smelled profit like rain. Norman sat at his desk and opened his tiny stapler. He made the habit of stapling things when he needed courage. It was small, ridiculous, and very human. He stapled the margins of his notes together and then, on a separate sheet, wrote the simplest of things: "We fumbled and were still human." He slid the paper into his coat and told himself he would be back in the hearing room in less than 3 days with testimony that could be filed and countersigned and notarized and blessed by someone very important. For a moment he allowed himself a small, private hope. In the lit corridor, a filing clerk dropped a stack of envelopes and mumbled an apology. The noise sounded unexpectedly like applause. Then the phone on his desk chimed. It was a calendar reminder: deadline, file, compassionate precedence. Norman rubbed his ink-stained fingers together, as if he could rub a plan into being. He looked up at the ceiling, and for no reason he could articulate, imagined the teapot in the break room, steaming and patient as ever, as if it would wait for him to return with the paperwork. He had 72 hours, he had allies, and he had a habit of finding small things in margins. He stood up and, as he did, he felt the peculiar, incredulous truth. The department that had catalog endings like receipts could not entirely ignore the messy thing that was living. Whether it would bend, reform, or remain an elaborate shell would be decided in days, in signatures and testimonies, and in the odd, improbable work of convincing an institution that a biscuit could count as evidence. The hook the hearing left in the air was not melodramatic. It was bureaucratic and therefore more terrifying. A deadline, a condition, a requirement. It demanded motion. It demanded that those who preferred forms to feelings now translate the feelings into forms. The world, meanwhile, kept hiccuping along, as if impatient to hear whether a department of clerks could render compassion admissible before the machinery of finality reset itself. Norman tucked his marginalia into the inner pocket of his jacket. feeling for once that his notes might be more than hermetic comforts. He walked toward the break room, where the kettle sat like a kindly, lukewarm oracle. On the way he passed Rita assembling a list of witnesses, Tom counting a stack of dubious prophecies, and Aria, who had broken protocol by bringing a file of memory, pinning a memo to a corkboard with the expression of a woman who had just betrayed her own rules in the name of saving a life. The 72 hours had begun. The Department of Catastrophes, in its peculiar and patient way, was about to try to convert kindness into evidence. Somewhere in the archives, a long file sighed. Somewhere else, Auditor Primus consulted its tablets, calculating precedent like someone weighing currency. The world waited, hiccuping politely, until the forms were either completed or fate decided to interpret its own margins. And in the tiny place where Norman kept his stapler, where his spectacles slid down and his marginalia lived, a small hope flickered in the shape of a sentence he had not dared to write on official paper. Perhaps, he thought, the forms will not be the only things that save us. Perhaps the messy, human stuff in the margins will count for more than we had presumed. The kettle clicked. Someone in the corridor laughed at something that might have been a joke. The clock on the wall continued its patient march. The hearing had ended. The staircase down to the basement smelled as if someone had decided that paper, when aged properly, ought to smell like a promise and a warning combined. Norman had, in his life, classified many scents: tepid kettle, stale policies, the sweet tang of correction fluid, but this was new, a metallic, quiet dust that made the ink on the ledgers look like islands on a brown sea. Mr. Enoch led them like a custodian of weather. He moved with the slow certainty of someone accustomed to guiding storms through broom handles, and when he pulled open the hatch, the sound that came up was a little like a drawer of long-forgotten utensils that had finally been shown their reflection. Light spilled down in narrow angles across brass bindings and paper that had been patient for centuries. People forget the basement, Mr. Enoch said, with the tone of one stating a geological fact. They think the important things happen at the top, the memos, the meetings, the stern typefaces. But the basement keeps the echoes. It remembers who bent the rules and why. Norman felt the smallness of his shoes against the stone steps. The department had 1,000 rooms designed to keep things orderly: the Hall of Appeals, the atrium of adjournment, the waiting room where time forgets to be polite. But the basement was where human hands had been clumsy and honest. He thought of the sentence had once annotated in the margins of an appellate decision: where rules are brittle, people are soft. He had meant it as a note to self about empathy. He had not realized it would be literal. They stepped into the archive proper. The ceiling was a low concern of beams and forgotten lighting fixtures. Rows of ledgers lay like sleeping animals on slatted shelves. A fan turned once in the far corner and then, deciding it had said enough, stopped. Dust lay in handwritten patterns on the covers, and the air tasted of glue and decisions. Gideon, who carried his tablet like a talisman against metaphor, immediately began to inventory. His fingers moved over catalog tags with the precision of someone tracing a broken syntax back to its origin. Even his metaphoric immunity faltered here. He clicked a few times and hummed as though the hum might be a password. "Look for marginals," Mr. Enoch said. "They don't like to be found. They prefer to be discovered." Aria reached for a ledger with one hand and, after the habit of a career, held her red pen ready. Norman hadn't seen her this unarmored. Before, there was a flicker in her eyes that made her bun look smaller, as if some internal wind had rearranged the hair. She had always presented as a machine forged of memos and decisiveness, but in the dim light, she was as human as the rest of them, which is to say, she was terribly mortal and terribly necessary. The book they found was a volume that had expected fewer interruptions. Its leather was cracked like old handwriting. When Norman opened it, a small cloud of dust portended the kind of revelation you only get with the accompaniment of a cough. "Found it," Gideon said, which is how he usually spoke of discoveries, as a creature of mild surprise rather than triumph. His projected tablet made the page larger, projecting faded ink onto the close wall so they could all see the smallness of the words. There, written in a cramped, almost apologetic hand in the margin of the charter, was a clause Norman felt he could recognize in his bones, an exception so nearly whispered that the paper itself seemed to hesitate. Remedial act permissible upon testamentation of human witnesses and appeal by non-departmental authority, Norman read aloud. His voice felt as though it had been ironed in public, but it didn't matter. It carried the sentence out into the room, and the sentence did what sentences do, it made things happen. That's. Aria began, and then closed her mouth as if she had been about to use a policy number, which was a powerful containment for her emotions. Rita, who had been leafing through a binder while the rest of them played archaeologists, set the binder down with the reverence of someone laying down a sleeping weapon. Non-departmental authority, Rita repeated like a woman saying the name of a very rare bird. Someone outside the department who counts. Someone who isn't catalogued here. A voice with weight. Someone very important, Tom said, smiling just enough to make the room colder and kinder at once. Mr. Enoch tapped the margin with his knuckle. His nail made a whisper of a sound like a small, obedient gavel. They were tired when they wrote that, he said, the first councils. They'd been up for days, steering earthquakes away from small towns by sheer force of paperwork. At some point, somebody began to believe compassion could be filed into the ledger, and not simply a note on the kitchen table. They wrote the clause and slipped it into the margin like a lullaby. They thought the clause would never be needed. Perhaps they were right, or perhaps they were exhausted and kind. Either way, it is here. Norman felt the clause press itself like an honest stamp into his palms. For all that the department treated its charter as something carved into bedrock, he knew bedrock sometimes contained seams and fossils, and, very occasionally, clerks who had loved too much. Narrow, Gideon said, irrefutable human testimony, an appeal by a non-departmental authority. Both are ambiguous in practice. The definition of irrefutable has an entire appendix in the 1842 codicil. He smiled, which meant he was thinking of all the appendices someone would have to read before noon. Which is why they put it in the margin, Aria said, blunt as a stapler. Because in the day-to-day, people wouldn't look there. Because it is an act of mercy written by exhausted hands. Because she stopped, and Norman realized she was saving the rest for when she could name it without sounding as if she had read her own heart aloud. Rita, practical and procedural, closed her eyes for a moment. If this clause is authentic and usable, it reframes everything. We don't need to find a loophole in the process so much as summon a witness and someone who speaks with weight beyond our own walls. We need proof of human worth and someone not us to say it matters. The problem with fitting hope into official forms, Norman thought ruefully, was that the forms had not been designed with hope in mind. They had been designed to keep things tidy, to prevent perverse incentives, to avoid precedent, to prevent the unstoppable proliferation of exceptions. Mercy in their systems was a wildflower in a parking lot, and the directorate knows this clause exists, Norman asked. The question was performed neatly. Norman had been asking neat questions for his entire life. The room listened with the attentive courtesy that forms had taught them. Mr. Notch shook his head slowly. They know it sits there. They have admitted its existence in footnotes and diplomatic hedges. But to use it is another thing. Rules are like fences. You can point to the gate until your finger cramps, but you still have to open it. Auditor Primus is fond of gates. As if cued by someone with excellent timing and an appetite for drama, a sealed envelope clacked down onto the table like a plot point. It bore the directorate's stamp and a flourish that looked suspiciously like an exclamation point rendered in ink. Auditor Primus' name was Performance in capital letters. Norman slid back, not that anyone had noticed. A letter with an institutional mood, had been dispatched to them the way clouds sometimes move to cover the sun, with purpose and a certain disdain for pleasantries. Gideon slit the envelope with a finger that did not trust razors. The paper within was businesslike. The diction was the sort that sits in a courthouse and coughs twice before making an opinion. To the Department of Catastrophes, it began. The Directorate of Finality notes the existence of borderline provisions, marginal clause 30b, listed in the founding charter and its appendices. However, the Directorate reaffirms the principle that exceptions to termination protocols must be sparing and founded on precedent. As such, any invocation of remedial acts requires pre-approval by the Directorate in the form and manner heretofore prescribed. Further delay in enforcement of active protocols is discouraged pending the Directorate's comprehensive review. The letter read like a polite slap. It contained in its measured syllables a declaration. The Directorate would use the Charter to deny exceptions unless someone else, with more ease in the world and less taste for siding with clerks, chose otherwise. They will use the Charter to deny the Charter, Tom said, and his voice had a rueful edge that suggested he'd seen this sort of paradox before. They will cite precedent to prevent a precedent. Aria leaned forward, her pen tapped, as though she were composing a memorandum to conscience. Primus is not simply reading the clause as a legal constraint, she said. They are weaponizing textual purity. If we invoke margin 13b without the appearance of the proper external voice, it will look like fraud. It will look like a conspiracy. It will make the Directorate's worst fears come true, and will give them license to clamp down permanently. Norman's hands were small islands in the ocean of the ledger. He folded and refolded a loose leaf until his fingers made it resemble something like a plan. The difficulty was not merely in finding the clause had been found, but in making it live. The margin had to be animated with human stories and an external appeal. Somebody outside the department had to be persuaded to say, this human worth is undeniable. Who can do that? Norman asked. Who does the Directorate respect other than itself? Silence answered at first, then a cascade of possible names: elder councils, a reclusive committee, a person who liked biscuits and drew the curtains in the evening. The joking names trailed off into the more serious ones, people whose signatures carried weight, because their life had not been spent filing but rather making. Enoch told them then what the margin and the fan of history had taught him. There is a tea maker, he said, a figure who likes biscuits and insists on proper teapots. They are not venerated in our rolls. They do not like unsolicited paperwork. When the first councils were young and their handwriting was jerky from fatigue, this person, or perhaps the office they keep, was sometimes consulted. They have a quiet way of making decisions stick without having to shout about them. They are a non-departmental authority because they own not a title but an old taste for decency. Norman's brain translated that into a more bureaucratic phrase, somebody very important. He had read memos about such people. He had signed carbon copies that mentioned their names with the same proper distance one used to refer to an earthquake. But he was a clerk. His instincts turned toward process rather than personalities. He imagined a file folder labeled someone very important with a neutral, exacting header. How do we find them? Rita asked, which was both tactical and maternal. She had a binder for such possibilities and began to flip through it as if it were a deck of playing cards that might happen to produce aces. We ask, Mitt, Enoch said, which was the only advice that had the dignity to be short. To ask someone who did not like unsolicited paperwork in order to secure an appeal that would breathe life into a marginal clause seemed, on the face of it, the sort of thing Norman was terrified of. It would require stepping beyond memos and into the messy business of entreaty. He thought of the poem he wrote in secret and kept folded in the back of his desk. The poem began with a breakfast and ended with bad weather, and, in the middle, had something like an honest request. We must gather testimony, Aria said. We must find irrefutable human stories, and we must do it fast. Auditor Primus has already signaled intent. If they set their seal, they will make every sympathetic margin vanish beneath the weight of precedent. That night the department hummed as if it had swallowed a bee. Lights blinked like eyelids fretting in sleep. Norman walked home with the ledgers, dust in the creases of his collar, and a new verb in his chest: to petition. He dreamt, that night, not of forms but of hands. Hands that wrote compassionate notes in the margins of a world that had once thought rules would be enough. He dreamed of a council that had, at the end of a long day, chosen a kindness small enough to fit in a margin and large enough to break a pattern. When he woke, the world outside his window had acquired a new, precarious tenderness. It was as if the clause, now discovered, had breathed its own small afternoon into the air. The work ahead was not about finding a loophole. It was about assembling proof, messy, human proof, and approaching a person who would listen. That person would be outside their charts, beyond their stamps. To approach them would require the very things the department guarded against: improvisation, sincerity, and the willingness to seize a biscuit and say, "This matters." Norman felt a kind of nervous clarity. He had been trained to panic gently. Now he would have to plead loudly, but not without grace. It was a new sort of bravery, administrative and personal and indecorous. And somewhere in the directorate, Auditor Primus read the same clause with a different beat. Primus' mind, a finely tuned instrument for the preservation of order, found in the margin both a wound and a remedy. The directorate's letter had been a strike. Now the discovery had answered that strike like a soft counterpoint. The next move would be theirs, or it would be Norman's. The chapter closed on the image of the marginal clause which, once read aloud, seemed to hum with possibility. The department's basement reclaimed some of its dust. Mere. Enoch filed his finger along the ledger's edge as if filing a nail. They left mercy in the margins when they were tired. He said, voice the sort of thing that could be a prophecy or a complaint. Mercy doesn't look like a statute. Mercy looks like a hand that forgot to close the gate. Outside, the world hiccuped once a small continental blip, as if reality were clearing its throat. Inside, Norman folded the loose leaf into his breast pocket. The margin had become a map, and the map suggested a pilgrimage that might, in the end, resemble asking an old person for a favor. It might require biscuits, or a poem, or a story so plain and true that a recluse would be moved to sign. It might fail, but it might not. And the possibility of might not was everything. They began to plan with the kind of ridiculous thoroughness only clerks can summon. Rita dialed old contacts whose phone numbers were written in the backs of grievances. Gideon began to compile an index of possible external authorities based on their public reluctance to publish memos. Tom suggested a list of likely biscuits and which types of biscuit corresponded to differing levels of officiousness. Aria wrote a memo so persuasive it made Norman feel unaccountably hopeful just reading it. Auditor Primus, in a place of papers and shadows, prepared its reply. The directorate could, as the letter intimated, choose to treat the margin as a quaint relic. Or it could decide that an exception would set the world aflame with requests. Both options were terrifying, and both would be argued with a zealotry that did not yet know compassion. Norman, carrying the marginal clause in his pocket like contraband, understood the simple logic that pulsed in his chest. The department's greatest fear: precedent was also their only way out. If they could show precedent rooted in human stories, and if a non-departmental voice would say, "This is worth it," then the margin would no longer be a whisper, but an arrival. It would be a kindness with legal teeth. He penned, in the margin of his mind, a list of small acts: a midwife who had delivered twins under floodlight and improvised a better cradle, a teacher who had given homework extensions because a child's house had been catalogued wrong by the city, a stranger who had paid for a stranger's teapot when the cafe's card machine died. These were not dramatic salvos. They were the sort of soft evidence that, in aggregate, made up the architecture of human worth. The charter clause had given them a shape. The world was wobbling like a lunch tray on a cart. Auditor Primus had heard them breathing. The next chapters would be about gathering witnesses and finding someone who would, possibly reluctantly, put their name on a document because, on a Tuesday with clouds guilty of ticking, somebody had once written mercy into the margins and hoped it would be enough.